There's a truth about time that most people don't understand until it's too late. They see me now, at 92, tending my garden or driving my own car into town, and they see a miracle. They ask about my diet, my genetics, my luck, but they're asking the wrong questions. My story isn't about defying age. It's about defying a verdict. 20 years ago, a doctor looked me in the eye and sentenced me to a slow, quiet fade into irrelevance. He told me the pain in my joints, the fog in my head, the weakness in my hands. It was just the price of a long life. It was a comfortable lie, one that society tells us to make our own surrender seem graceful. But in that sterile office with the smell of antiseptic in the air, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't surrender. It was rage. A quiet, deep rebellion against the idea that my life's final chapter had already been written by someone else. That was the day I decided to fight back, not against time, but for my own dignity. Before that moment, my mornings were a ritual of defeat. I'd wake before the sun, not with purpose, but because the pain in my hips and back wouldn't let me sleep. The first thought of the day wasn't about what I would do, but what I couldn't do. Every step from the bed to the bathroom was a negotiation with my own body. I remember staring at my reflection, a man I barely recognized, his face etched with a profound fatigue that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion of the soul. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the shame that came with it, the shame of asking for help to open a jar, the shame of my hand trembling as I tried to sign my name, the shame of feeling like a guest in my own life. I was becoming a burden, a ghost haunting the hallways of the home I'd built. That doctor's words, "It's just age," were meant to be a comfort, an absolution. Instead, they felt like a final nail in the coffin of the man I used to be. My world had shrunk to the four walls of the house I'd built with my own two hands. Every morning was the same slow-motion replay of loss. The grandfather clock in the hall, which I used to wind with a steady hand, now seemed to mock me with its relentless ticking, counting down the minutes of a life I was no longer living. My wife, Martha, would leave a cup of coffee on the nightstand, a simple act of love that felt like a daily reminder of my own helplessness. I'd watch my hand tremble as I reached for it, the ceramic feeling impossibly heavy. The man who had framed this house, who had hoisted beams and laid floors, couldn't be trusted with a simple mug. I'd sit in my worn leather armchair, the one where our children used to climb on my lap, and just stare out the window. The world outside was vibrant, but in here, the air was thick with the dust of memories and the silence of a man who had forgotten how to participate in his own story. I was becoming a curator of a museum dedicated to a man I no longer was. The garden was my greatest surrender. I used to spend hours out there, my hands deep in the soil, feeling the rhythm of the seasons. Now I could only watch through the glass as weeds slowly reclaimed the flower beds I'd so carefully planned. It was a living, breathing testament to my own decay. My car keys hung on a hook by the door, untouched for months, gathering a fine layer of dust. They were more than just metal. They were a symbol of a freedom I had forfeited without a fight. Friends would call, their voices full of a pity I couldn't stand, inviting me to things I knew I couldn't do. Each no thank you was another brick in the wall I was building around myself. I wasn't just losing my strength, I was losing my connection to everything that had once defined me. I was becoming a spectator to the life of the man I used to be, a ghost haunting the edges of his own vibrant past. And the worst part was, I was starting to believe this was all that was left for me. The appointment was the final stop on a long road of quiet surrenders. I sat on the edge of the examination table, the thin paper crinkling beneath me, a sound that felt as fragile as I did. The doctor, a man half my age with eyes that held a professional sympathy but no real understanding, flipped through my chart. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, listing off my ailments as if they were items on a grocery list. The arthritis, the dizziness, the persistent fog that was clouding my thoughts. I wanted to tell him about the man I was, the one who could shingle a roof in a single afternoon, the one who taught his son how to drive. But in that room, I wasn't a man. I was just a chart, a collection of symptoms. Then he looked up from his notes, offering a small, practiced smile. "Mr. Anderson," he said, his voice laced with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "There's nothing acutely wrong here. It's just age." The words hung in the sterile air, simple, clean, and utterly devastating. They were meant to be a release, but they felt like a cage. I don't remember much of the drive home. My hands were on the wheel, my foot on the pedal, but my mind was back in that sterile room, trapped by those three simple words. It's just age, a verdict delivered without a trial, a life sentence for the crime of living too long. I saw other people on the sidewalks, laughing, walking with purpose, their bodies obeying them without a second thought. For months, I had looked at them with a deep, aching sense of envy and loss. But now, for the first time, I felt a different emotion rising from the pit of my stomach. It was a hot, slow-burning anger. An anger at the doctor, at the world, but mostly at myself for so willingly accepting this narrative of decay. Was this it? Was the entire sum of my life, my work, my love, my memories to be dismissed with a shrug and a medical platitude? The man I had been wouldn't have stood for it. He would have fought. And in the quiet hum of the engine, a question began to form, a dangerous, rebellious whisper. What if the doctor was wrong? When I walked through the front door, the house felt different. The familiar silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was suffocating. Martha met me in the hall, her eyes full of the gentle worry I had grown to resent because it reflected my own weakness back at me. "What did he say, dear?" she asked, her voice soft, already prepared for another report of inevitable decline. I looked past her at the small collection of orange pill bottles lined up on the kitchen counter like little soldiers of surrender. For months they had been my reality, my morning ritual. But now, seeing them after hearing that doctor's verdict, they looked like an insult. They were symbols of a battle I hadn't even tried to fight. I didn't answer her right away. I just stood there, the doctor's words echoing in my head, and I felt the tectonic plates of my life begin to shift. I finally met her gaze and said something I hadn't said in years, the words feeling foreign and powerful on my tongue. "He said I'm old," I replied, but for the first time the word didn't sound like a diagnosis. It sounded like a challenge. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had once been the soundtrack to my surrender. But tonight it sounded different. It wasn't counting down my remaining time. It was counting up, marking the first moments of a new life. The doctor's words, "It's just age," were a comfortable lie designed to make the end easier for everyone. But it wasn't easy. It was a slow, humiliating erasure of a man's soul, a quiet fading into irrelevance. And I decided right there in the suffocating stillness of my bedroom that I would not be erased. I didn't know how. I had no map, no miracle cure. All I had was this raw, burning ember of defiance in my chest. I knew the pain would be there in the morning. I knew the fog would try to descend, but I made a promise to the man I used to be, a vow whispered into the darkness. Tomorrow I would not just wake up. Tomorrow I would show up and I would fight. The first morning was a joke, a cruel, painful comedy. My mind had made this grand declaration of war the night before, but it had forgotten to inform my body. I woke up to the same familiar chorus of aches, the same stiffness in my joints that felt like cold cement. The old habit was to lie there, to let the pain win the first battle of the day, to wait for Martha to bring me my coffee and my pills. But the anger from the day before was still there, a hot coal in my gut. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, and the sharp protest from my hips and back was so intense it almost made me laugh. I sat there in the pre-dawn gloom, breathing hard, my hands shaking not from weakness but from the sheer effort of this one simple act of defiance. The voice of doubt was deafening. It told me I was a fool, an old man playing a child's game, that I was going to hurt myself. But beneath that was the memory of the doctor's face, his professional pity, and it was that insult that got me to my feet. My rebellion didn't start with a triumphant march. It started with me in my pajamas, trying to touch my toes and barely making it past my knees. Each movement was a negotiation, a painful reminder of how much I had let go. I remember standing in the living room trying to do a simple stretch I'd seen in a magazine, and my own hands, trembling as I tried to hold the position, felt like they belonged to someone else. They were the hands of a stranger. That was the moment the shame hit me again, not the quiet shame of surrender, but a new burning shame of how far I had fallen. The worst part wasn't the weakness. It was the stark realization that I had willingly participated in my own dismantling. I had accepted the verdict long before the judge had even spoken. Every day for that first week, every muscle screamed in protest. The temptation to just go back to my chair, to the quiet comfort of giving up, was a physical pull as real as gravity, but I couldn't. I was fighting for more than my body. I was fighting for the right to recognize the man in the mirror again. There's a hard truth about this kind of fight. It's lonely. To the outside world, to Martha, it just looked like I was in more pain. She'd watch me with worried eyes as I stubbornly refused her help with my coat, as I insisted on walking to the mailbox, a journey that felt like a mile. She couldn't see the war I was waging inside. No one could. We're taught to fear death, but we should really fear the slow surrender that happens long before it. The real end comes the day you wake up and decide not to fight anymore. And there were days I came close. Days when the fog in my head was so thick that the anger felt distant and the pain felt absolute. On those mornings, I'd look at the pill bottles on the counter, those little orange promises of an easier day, and the only thing that stopped me was a quiet, stubborn question. If I give up today, who will I be tomorrow? I had no proof this would work. I had no guarantee of success. All I had was the blind, desperate faith that the man I used to be was still in there somewhere, waiting for me to show up. It must have been about 3 weeks into my silent war. The initial hot rage that had propelled me out of bed had cooled into a stubborn, grinding chore. Every morning was the same brutal negotiation with my own body, a ritual of pain and resistance. The voice of doubt had grown louder, more insidious. It whispered to me in the dark before dawn, telling me I was a fool, that this self-inflicted misery was pointless. It reminded me of the comfort of my armchair, the simplicity of surrender. I was just rearranging the furniture on a sinking ship. I had no evidence that any of this was working. The pain was still my first companion in the morning, the fog still a familiar shroud. I was tired, not just physically, but a deep, soul-level exhaustion that came from fighting a battle with no visible enemy and no sign of progress. I was on the brink of letting go, of admitting the doctor was right after all. Then came a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because the garbage trucks were making their rounds, a sound that had always been part of the bleak morning soundtrack. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, bracing for the familiar, sharp protest from my hips, and then nothing. Not silence, not a miracle, but a noticeable change in volume. The sharp stabbing pain was gone. In its place was a dull, manageable ache, like a distant echo of the usual agony. I stood up. The room didn't sway. I took a breath and it felt deeper, cleaner. The fog in my head, the thick, cottony blanket that usually smothered my thoughts, had thinned to a light mist. I stood there motionless in the pre-dawn light, just feeling. I felt my feet flat on the wooden floor. I felt the strength in my own legs holding me up without a tremor. For the first time in years, I wasn't a prisoner negotiating with my jailer. I was just a man, standing in his own room. That was the moment everything broke open. The revelation didn't come with a flash of light, but with a quiet, profound sense of clarity that washed over me. I finally understood. My fight was never against age. It was never against the arthritis or the dizziness or the doctor. It was against the story I had been told, the story I had started to tell myself, that my life was over. The doctors give you pills for your blood pressure, your joints, your mind. But I realized no one can give you a pill for your dignity, that you have to earn back yourself. Every single morning, this painful daily ritual wasn't about erasing the number of my years. It was about reclaiming the man who had lived them. The pain was a fact, but the surrender was a choice. In that quiet room, I wasn't just a 70-year-old man with failing joints. I was a man who was finally, after a long and bitter winter, learning how to choose himself again. The anger that had started this journey evaporated in that moment, and in its place, a calm, unshakable resolve settled deep in my bones. My morning routine was no longer a punishment. It was no longer an act of defiance against a world that had written me off. It became something sacred. It became my ritual of reclamation. It was the daily, conscious act of choosing strength over weakness, clarity over fog, and dignity over despair. I understood that this small victory wasn't the end of the battle, but it was the first piece of undeniable proof that the war was winnable. I wasn't trying to turn back the clock. I was learning how to wind it myself again, with purpose and with intention. I was no longer a victim of time. I was becoming the architect of my own days, building my future not on the hope of a miracle, but on the solid foundation of a single intentional morning. That new understanding changed everything. The fight was no longer a bitter struggle against my own body. It became a quiet, daily conversation with it. My morning routine transformed from an act of war into an act of respect. It wasn't about punishing myself for years of neglect, but about honoring the man I wanted to be. I began to see that the doctors, with all their knowledge, missed the most important diagnosis. They can measure your blood pressure, scan your bones, and prescribe pills for every symptom. But I realized no one can give you a pill for your dignity. That you have to earn back yourself every single morning. The anger that had been my fuel was replaced by a calm, steady intention. I wasn't fighting against death anymore. I was simply, profoundly fighting for my life, one deliberate stretch, one clear-headed moment at a time. My purpose was no longer to defy a doctor's verdict, but to write my own. With this new clarity, I started to look at my house not as a prison, but as a training ground. The garden, which had been a monument to my decay, became my first challenge. I didn't go out there with a grand plan to reclaim it all at once. My first victory was simply putting on my old boots and walking to the edge of the patio. The next day I picked up a single tool, a hand trowel, just to feel its familiar weight. I spent 10 minutes pulling one weed, then went back inside. It was a ridiculously small act, but it was mine. I did the same with my car keys. For a week, I just took them off the hook and held them in my pocket, reacquainting myself with the feeling of freedom. I was rebuilding my life not with grand gestures, but with the smallest, most intentional acts of participation. I was teaching myself slowly and patiently that I was not a spectator. I was still the man who lived here. The world didn't change overnight. The pain didn't vanish. But my relationship with it was fundamentally altered. It was no longer the defining feature of my existence. It was just a piece of the landscape I had to navigate each day. Martha started to notice the difference, not in what I said, but in how I stood. The slump of defeat in my shoulders was gone, replaced by a quiet posture of resolve. The pill bottles on the kitchen counter began to gather dust, not because of a miracle, but because I had found a stronger medicine, purpose. I was learning that true independence isn't about being free from limitations. It's about the daily, conscious choice to build a life of meaning within them. I had accepted my age, the number 70-something, but I had completely and utterly rejected the story that was supposed to come with it. I was no longer winding down. I was rebuilding from the ground up on a foundation of my own making. Today, when I'm out in my garden, my hands deep in the soil, I don't feel 92. I don't feel young either. I just feel present. This garden, this house, the keys to my car hanging by the door, they aren't trophies of a battle won against time. They are the quiet results of more than 7,000 mornings, 7,000 times I chose to stand up when it would have been easier to lie down. I finally understood that the doctor wasn't my enemy. My own story of surrender was. He just gave it a voice. We spend so much of our lives looking for a miracle cure, a grand solution. But the truth I had to learn the hard way is that life isn't reclaimed in a single heroic moment. It's reclaimed in the quiet discipline of a single morning, repeated until it becomes who you are. The real medicine was never in those orange bottles. It was in the daily, thankless, and sacred ritual of choosing to show up for my own life, especially on the days I didn't want to. People ask me for the secret to a long life, but they're still asking the wrong question. It's not about adding years to your life, it's about adding life to your years. And that work, that beautiful, difficult work, begins in the first hour of your day. That hour is the most honest conversation you will ever have with yourself. It's where you decide if you're a victim of your circumstances or the author of your response. It's where your future self is born, not from a grand promise, but from a single intentional breath. I didn't get this second life by accident. I built it one morning at a time on a foundation of quiet resolve. My fight is mostly over now, but yours is always beginning every time the sun comes up. So I'll leave you with the only question that has ever truly mattered. When you wake up tomorrow, what story will you choose to tell yourself?